So here we go. It's 11 o'clock. Welcome to Horde's Dairyman live stream. We're going to talk about demand reconstruction. And that's the focus of our April 22nd episode here. We're delighted to have Cargill be our sponsor here. And we always want to do a shout out, and we did a few of them last week. And one of the shout outs here is to Ohio Dairy Producers Association and the American Dairy Association Mideast, who partnered with Ohio Feeding America food banks to deliver over 20,000 gallons of milk, and that number will be growing immensely. It's an ongoing project. And we have two special guests here for Dairy Livestream here, and we're going to invite Chad Vincent of Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin to open our program today here, obviously representing the dairy farmers throughout the Badger State. And he's coming to us live from Madison, Wisconsin. And Chad, what are you seeing in the field here throughout this COVID-19 crisis, and how things are changing from the dairy product side?
Yeah, boy, it's unprecedented times for sure. And Corey, thanks for inviting me today. And on behalf of the Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin, we run the Checkoff and promotion group here in the state. A little bit about me. I've been in this job for 3 years. I came out of industry. I worked as a processor on the cheese side for 7 or 8 years. I've been running, big businesses across the country for the last 25 years. It's incredible what's happening out here. And I'll speak mostly just about Wisconsin, although I think most of the things, John, we'll talk about California. Most of the things we're going to talk about are happening everywhere. The food service collapse is unprecedented. We're, Wisconsin, roughly, 40% of the volume in the state goes through food service, and that's restaurants, but it's also universities, and it's football stadiums, and it's conferences, and we're basically wherever you're going to eat outside the home. 60+% of our butter in the state goes there as well. So it's a big deal. You've got probably 70 to 80% of the food service restaurants in the country have closed. We heard last week 3% are done for good, and they projected at the end of this month we might have a 10% or 11% of restaurants that are done for good. So it's a massive structural change. What's really interesting is, we're really strong in grocery, and there's really good things happening there, and I'll cover that in just a sec. If I can just take a second to step back and say, Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin is the Checkoff. We're really here. We exist, and we're created by farmers in 1983. And our main jobs are, we're really your marketing and promotion group. There's a lot of things that we do, and there's a lot of things that we wish we could do, but really, we're here to build trust in dairy and dairy farming and dairy farmers. We're here to develop markets, which means we sell products without ever selling. We work with and through. So we work with the grocery stores. We work with the restaurants. We work with processors to try and build markets and get products sold and on shelves and in places where it needs to be, where consumers can get to them. I think one of the biggest things, though, is that we're the advocate for the farmers. We're the voice. So if we weren't here with all the anti-animal ag and anti-dairy groups out there, if we're not here, who's the voice in telling our stories and keeping things positive and bringing people together and making sure that the farmers' voices are really heard? And we're also very active in schools and youth and making sure that the next generations grow up understanding agriculture, dairy, and what it does for the good for the planet and good for your health and your soul. The good news is that on the retail side in Wisconsin, the numbers are spectacular. When I say retailers, it's grocery, right? And every time you scan a product across, you go to grocery store, all that stuff's recorded and tracked. The first couple of weeks that this happened, that all of a sudden the COVID thing really started to hit, people ran to the grocery stores, and the sales for dairy were up 60+% for a couple of weeks. Stockouts everywhere. They couldn't keep things on the shelf. They didn't have enough workers to keep things going. It was chaos, but the numbers were amazing. I mean, fluid milk has been on a 40-year decline of a percent or two. It grew significantly. I mean, milk sales were up in the first 2 weeks, were up in the 40% rate in Wisconsin. And things slowed down a little bit, but they slowed down to where they're up only, like this week, our retail sales in Wisconsin for dairy were up 28%. cheese was up 35%, butter was up 30%, and milk was up 20%. And typically in this world, a 1% or 2% gain is a big deal. So these are huge numbers, but it's just not enough to overcome the loss of the food service, the collapse of the food service and restaurant business. So so that's kind of what's going on. We got some great news. And you see families together, they're drinking milk. Cereal sales are up double digit for the first time in years. Frozen pizza is up double digits. All these places that use a lot of dairy in their products that we eat at home, really, really good numbers. So from a Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin perspective, we focus in again on building trust, developing markets, and being the advocate and the voice, and making sure that we're telling the stories. But we've had to pivot, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that happened in the last couple of weeks, and we don't have our head in the sand. So there's a couple of things that we've done. We changed our communication and messaging to being more focused on things that happen at home, recipes that are used at home, and less about aspirational and getting together and having, because cheese is a big convener. And in Wisconsin, we eat our milk. I mean, 90% of the milk in the state goes to cheese. And a lot of that stuff is sold across the country. So you can find Wisconsin cheese in 98% of the grocery stores across the country. So we changed our communications and our messaging. We spent an incredible amount of time partnering with people like Department of Ag, and Randy Romansky here, the Secretary of Ag, has stepped up and doing a great job partnering up with food banks. And I know we'll circle back to that a little bit later. And we've spent a lot of time with grocers. The Wisconsin Grocers Association, we're on calls with them constantly to get, the stop limits, right? Farmers are going to stores and you can buy 1 gallon of milk and 1 pound of butter. Drove them nuts. So we put together a website that said, look, drop your information in here, we'll call. We've had over 350 of those so far. And actually now with partnership with Wisconsin Grocers Association, we're getting email blasts to the grocers every week explaining the pain that it puts the farmers through. And for the most part, those limits have come off. I mean, Target pulled them off last week. And they're actually now putting up signs in stores saying, buy dairy, support Wisconsin dairy farmers. So there's a lot of really cool things going on, but we've got a lot of people here that are a lot smarter and know a lot more than me. So I'd like to turn the ball over to, I think it's John in California.
Thank you, Chad, and really great perspective. Again, pleased to have Cargill as a co-sponsor of our event here today. And now we're going to turn it over to John Talbot, CEO of the California Milk Advisory Board. Certainly, John's probably seeing some of the same things in California. However, California is also a different market here, being on the Pacific Rim there with exports to Asia. So he may want to talk domestic before he talks a little bit of export, but John is coming to us from Danville, California. And John, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Corey. Appreciate it. We are, as everyone has said many times, in unprecedented territory here. The disruption that the dairy supply chain is going through right now is just incredible. There used to be this really nice 50-50 volume balance between retail and food service. And now with restaurants and schools closed, everyone working at home, eating at home, it's estimated that 80% of consumer demand is being forced through retail. And trying to jam 2 channels through one just isn't working. And the problem is the entire grocery supply chain, not just dairy, has been optimized around just-in-time inventory management. It's all about minimizing costs. From processors to distributors to retailers, no one wants to carry excess inventory, which is all fine until you have a crisis. So when the demand shifts like it has put a huge impact on the entire dairy supply chain. Processors are running at maximum capacity. Retailers are just trying to keep up, and food service operators are trying to sell product to whoever will take it, whether that be retailers or even direct to consumers in some cases. But this just-in-time inventory issue is here to stay, I hate to say. It would cost way too much to change that system dramatically. The good news is that e-commerce both delivery and click and collect, are growing. And that has helped out this situation immeasurably. I can't even imagine how much worse it would be if we didn't have these online tools. Corey, you mentioned export, and it is a very important part of the California industry here. Exports make up about 30% of our total milk utilization, about double what it is for the balance of the U.S. And what we're seeing is a little more of a mixed bag with some good and some bad markets. China, even though, was shut down for a couple months at least, is back looking strong. Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, all operating relatively normal. But others like Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines are shut down and will be at least into May. Mexico, the issue is a little different there. It's the economy. When you look at the foreign exchange ratio, the peso is at 24-1 right now, and that would be major cause for concern under normal conditions. But because U.S. dairy prices are so low, we're actually seeing pretty decent product movement into Mexico right now. The biggest problem on the export side is actually, as related to China, having been closed for a couple months, the entire global freight industry is gummed up. There are just too many containers in China and in other parts of Asia right now, and it's going to take a while to clean that up. The good news, though, is that demand is up. We're getting lots of interested phone calls from people. Our old buyers want to get back in the market, and it all, at least looks encouraging. If I were to step back just for a minute and a little bit of an overview on CMAB, it's a very similar organization to Chad's. We've just recently kind of refocused all of our efforts into two primary buckets right now. The first one is more short-term, call it triage. It's all about fixing what's broken. And similarly to what Chad mentioned, we're working with retailers to try and get the consumer limit signs off the dairy case. We're working with a merchandising company called Crossmark to survey and restock shelves at the top 300 California stores. We're working on new points of distribution, whether that's working with restaurants that are trying to get set up as grocery stores with limited distribution of consumer products, or even some other food service operators who are trying to sell milk through their takeout and drive-through windows. People like even McDonald's, Subway, very interested in selling milk. So that's encouraging. E-commerce, again, trying to find ways to get products into new e-commerce channels. People are eating breakfast again, which is a wonderful thing because that's doing great things for milk and cereal consumption. So we're working on a cross promotion there. And, on the longer term side, our focus right now is really about trying to reimagine food service, working with operators to redefine what that might look like a year from now, 5 years from now. I think that channel is going to be hit pretty hard. It's hard to say where it ends up, but we're already hearing about potential new regulations around food preparation, food handling. I think you can pretty well bet that salad bars and buffet lines are going to be a thing of the past. I hate to say it. Seating capacity. There's going to be issues there in terms of being limits, reductions, potential remodeling, to restaurants. Then they've got to go out and, rehire and retrain their staffs, increase costs, the whole thing. It could take a while, and we're still not even sure how many consumers are going to be willing to go back. So I think the food service
Thank you, John. There's a lot of reimagination and pivoting taking place here. And speaking of pivoting here, I can't remember the last time I had a press conference that took place at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, but the attendance was robust. The presenter was USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. Not only was there a lot of ag media on the line, the likes of the Wall Street Journal and ABC News and others were on that call that went for 55 minutes. And Mark, I'm going to start with you here. So we're going to talk a little bit, there are some unknowns yet. There are some knowns about the rollout of the program. It's a $16 billion program. $2.9 billion has been directed to direct payments for dairy producers. What did you learn in the last few days, Mark?
Well, I have heard a few things, and I think that there are a few things that we actually do know. For one thing, it is an unusual time to have a press event like that. And ordinarily, when we see something like that, we're suspicious that we're trying to sneak something out between news cycles, on a late on a Friday evening. I'm not sure that was the case here, but nevertheless, it was an odd time. We also had a follow-up press event with Senator John Hoeven from North Dakota, who's on the Senate Ag Committee, and he actually provided a little bit more in the way of details. Now, I would say that that's not a given, but perhaps it provides us some additional guidance. As you mentioned, $2.9 billion was identified for dairy. We know that. It is going to be paid out based on estimated market losses due to coronavirus. That's a kind of a big question mark. I mean, that's a nice parameter, but how are they going to do that? We also have heard that the direct payments to producers would be for 85% of those losses from January through April 15th. And from April 15th through the next 2 quarters, which would be October 15th, we would pay for 30% of the expected market losses. We've also heard that there would be a $125,000 limit on total payments to any given entity. And Secretary Perdue, I think, in his comments made it abundantly clear that he, at least, is not interested in reopening the dairy margin coverage program for additional sign-up. And, with all due respect, that might have been his decision in some gray area, but I do also think that if in subsequent bills Congress came through and said, no, we will open that up, that's not a choice he would have. It could be open, but we don't know that for sure. So what don't we know? Well, we don't exactly know how the losses would be determined. You could use possibly futures markets. You could look at the WASDE forecasts before and after we knew about coronavirus. We don't know what milk would actually be covered. Would these be paid to dairy farmers after their monthly milk shipments, over the next several months? Would you have a single payment that might be based on shipments that you had established maybe around March of this year? That's something that people have talked about. Or might they be based on historic milk production that we've already got for most dairy producers under the dairy margin coverage program? Those are all possibilities. We also don't exactly know what an entity is that would be the limitation on that $125,000. Would that be for multiple sites, perhaps sites in different states? Would they receive limits on each of those entities? Would it be for a single ownership or individual? The other thing that's come up as a question, and that is the possibility of whether that $125,000 limit would be from combined payments from things like dairy margin coverage program, which, by the way, we are expecting some substantial payments for this year, and this new new coronavirus food assistance program payments. That would be a possibility. We expect that Farm Service Agency is going to be the agency that actually administers a program, but again, that's not specifically known. Just as far as the dairy margin coverage program is concerned, we've got a couple of months already where we're forecast in May and June are down in that mid $4.50 range. So if you had bought $9.50 coverage, you'd be looking at $5 payments in that particular month. Those could be significant. And if we're looking at the entire year this year, for 5 million pounds that would be covered under the expected payments under DMC, we're looking at about $90,000 in total payments. So $90,000 chews up quite a lot of the headspace that you have in that $125,000 limit if those things are combined. So we do need to look at that and listen. I've also had some people ask questions about what about the dairy revenue protection? Would that also fall under the limits? Don't know. Again, that's in the question mark, but those are two different parts of USDA. That's the Risk Management Agency for the Dairy Revenue Protection Program and Farm Service Agency for dairy margin coverage. And boy, I think that trying to combine that data and use that combination is something like a moonshot. It's maybe possible, but highly unlikely. So based on my own estimates, I've taken a look at futures markets forecasts as of January 24th, which would have been just before we got news of coronavirus, and April 17th, this last Friday, and looked at the difference in what the markets were expecting through the rest of the year. February through December, the all milk price forecast based on that, I further discounted another 75 cents because we've had a lot of milk that is being sold under distressed prices and depooled. So I don't think that our normal estimates would be accounted for properly. If I do all of that, my estimate is that payments would be roughly in that $1.60 a hundredweight range. So $1.60 a hundredweight gives you at least a rough parameter. It might be a little bit less, it might be a little bit more than that, but that's somewhere in that range. If you think about just that $120,000 or $25,000 limit with $1.60 payment per hundredweight, we're talking about a farm of a little over 300 cows that would hit the limit on these payments. About 90% of farms in the country would not hit that limit based on that size, unless, again, they're combined with something like the DMC payments. But under all of those assumptions that I've made, if we paid out that much money to individual farms, we're still falling well short of that $2.9 billion that was identified as being allocated. In fact, maybe $1 billion short. So I don't know what that means. This could be money that might additionally be used under food purchases and giveaway. It could possibly be paid out under a second tranche of payments. It might just be left unspent in the Treasury. We've seen that kind of thing happen too. The other thing I would say is that if the WASDE forecasts are used, those are much more conservative than the futures markets, and so the payments would be lower based on that. If historic milk production is used instead of current or contemporary milk production, then the payments would also be lower. So that's my estimate of what this particular program might mean.
And Mark, I'm always wanting to bust acronyms so our viewers can know that. And WASDE is the World Agricultural Demand and Supply Estimates, correct?
Yes, they are. Sorry about that.
One other quick question before we move on to Andy here. Are they going to, do you know what milk production base is going to be used? That question's been asked a lot in the phone calls I've been receiving from dairy farmers.
No, that's a big question. As I mentioned, I think it's entirely possible that we could look and say, wait until you've had the sales in the particular month, and based on those sales, you would be paid whatever the per hundredweight basis is, up to the point that perhaps you hit that 125,000 pound limit or dollar limit. That's one possibility. The other might be that we use historic milk production. That's been used for things like the market facilitation payments as well as dairy margin coverage program. So that's a possibility too. But that's getting to be back there quite a few years, and there's been a lot of milk production growth on individual farms since that time period.
For sure. And I let my phone calls pile up, and as you can see, I'm in the office here on my 40-minute drive back and forth to and from work. I try to call those dairymen and dairywomen that are calling me, and there are a lot of unknown details here. I think, quite frankly, USDA Secretary Perdue Friday night wanted to get the program announced so that the system can get working and know how much money they're working with. Obviously, I know many of the conversations I had, people were like, I'd like to know the details now so I can do some planting. Throughout much of the country, people are trying to do spring planting, especially in a dairy farm background. With that, we're going to turn the program over to Andy Novakovic, and there's the second part of that program, and that involves food purchases and monthly food purchases. It looks like there could be totaling up to $300 million in three categories: milk, meat, and veggies and fruit. So, Andy?
Yeah, we do have some pretty good detail on the food donation program that was enabled by the CARES Act and is going under the title of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, of which the direct payments are also a part. A total of $3 billion has been allocated. As Corey said, it's being projected in $100 million a month across three product categories: meat, fresh fruits and vegetables, and dairy products. And more specifically now, USDA has indicated that it's trying to spread this food availability for donation programs from about the middle of May through the end of December. So they want to pace the purchases. They've also identified that in the fresh fruit and vegetable category, they're focusing, it's not just a focus, they're saying it's restricted to fresh produce, which hopefully will continue to be available between now and the end of December. And they've particularly identified tomatoes, strawberries, and then a basket of fruits and vegetables, which I think really lean heavily on the fact that these are products that are grown in the United States. So we're not going to probably be stuffing these bags with a lot of kiwi fruit and bananas. On the meat side, they've decided to focus on chicken and pork. I don't know why, but that's what's indicated. And dairy is dairy. They've suggested yogurt and cheeses and fluid milk. I think we don't necessarily need to heat up fluid milk plants much more, but the notion is that this is a nutritious product for folks who lack the means to purchase food because they've been unemployed or they're newly unemployed. The also rather clever thing that I did not at all anticipate, but makes all kinds of sense, is the idea is that USDA will subsidize the food that goes into an emergency food box so that the manufacturers of the food, the people like groups like Feeding America that assemble these boxes and then make them available to local distributors, can literally have a situation where you drive up, somebody picks up a box and goes in your trunk and away you go. So this is not like the old programs of handing out blocks of processed cheese at senior centers or whatever. And it fits, I think, both the time and the need. I think it's a great idea. I think it offers an opportunity to get milk back into plants, as both Chad and John were saying, that have been idled because of the tremendous demand destruction. I would say fluid milk and yogurt plants aren't really the ones that have been hit the hardest, but cheese has been hit very hard, and I think the selection of cheeses that are available could make a huge difference to folks that have lost customers. That I think is excellent news, and it's really good for folks that need some help, both on the dairy side, but also on the consumer side. The other thing that I'd throw in is, if we created a program to buy 5-pound loaves of processed cheese, we'd be buying a hell of a lot more milk equivalent than we will by putting in these emergency food boxes. And so the bang for the buck is a little bit less on the producer side, but it certainly is much more favorable in terms of the consumer side of the equation. And I do think that by getting milk back into these plants, it should help to find a bottom on prices, because right now, we're not only dumping milk, but we don't really know exactly where the bottom is, and that will be shored up if these plants can find something useful to do with milk, even if it is for a non-commercial sale.
Andy, real quick here before we following up to a statement you just said, any pulse here on has the amount of milk dumped increased, stayed the same, or diminished a little bit here since our last week's program, or just not enough to say?
Well, we still don't have really precise data. Federal Milk Marketing Order folks have data. Some of the orders will publish it. I've been clicking on the refresh button for my Northeast order information regularly, and that'll give us a first indication. What I think Mark and I are detecting, and others of you may have further insights, is that we may see that the amount of milk that's officially categorized and recorded as dumped is a little lower than we might have guessed. But what we aren't going to know is how much milk was being sold as a distressed sale, where milk is sold at a deep, deep discount to enable a processor like a block or even barrel cheesemaker to purchase that milk at a discount, make a product, and then stick it in a warehouse, hoping that somewhere down the road they're going to be able to sell it for something that recovers their cost. They're not going to have any revenue to back up that purchase. This is all in expectation of future sales, and they're going to be paying for storing it. So it's better than dumping, but it's not exactly like a normal business. And I think if we had the data, we'd find out that the stressed milk sales is probably a lot larger than the dump milk.
Thank you, Andy. So we're going to open this up for questions, and there's a question drop-down menu for all of our viewers here. We have a record attendance here. We just popped over 530, in fact. Maggie and Caitlin here in our office in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, actually built by Governor W.D. Hord here in 1908. So we've been here for many years. We'll be going through the questions. Jim Baltz at the University of Illinois is our producer here. And so I appreciate their help, and most certainly a thank you to Cargill once again for sponsoring today's program. So Chad and John, we're going to turn the first question over to you. Shopping patterns have definitely changed. You both talked about that. And I was reading an article just last night from Mark McCulley in Chicagoland. RBC Research online grocery purchases have doubled from a year ago, and that was before COVID-19. Plus, we're seeing shifts in purchasing patterns as people shop less often, but making much larger food purchases when they do go out of their bunkers at home and go to the store. What are you seeing? And talk a little bit more about how that is impacting dairy.
John, I'll let you start.
Okay. Well, I'll start by saying this. The first couple weeks were completely panic-driven, consumer hoarding kinds of purchase behavior that is very abnormal. And that was driven by the fear that they might not ever get to go back to a supermarket, at least for the foreseeable future. And so they were buying as much as they could. And that's why retailers put limits on everything. But that has settled down now to more of a traditional stock up type shopping routine where you would go to the store once every couple weeks and buy what you really needed for that upcoming 2-week period. What's missing now are the kind of the fill-in shopping trips that we used to be getting very regularly in the past. Those have been reduced. Obviously, convenience store volume is down, but we've kind of settled into this little more regular buying pattern, heavier than normal, fewer trips than normal, but more rational, I would say.
Chad?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really add a whole lot onto what John has said. The retail side they're struggling at the store level still to try and keep things operating, and the costs that they are facing are up significantly as well. I look at it and say that there's an that it's a really positive thing for us in the short term and in the long term. I think that people have realized that there's a power of having families together and eating meals together. And we're seeing the gallon jugs on the table again for the first time in a long time. And, I think it's one of the things that we're working on is to make sure we remind people to say, hey, look, when things got tough, look what you went back to. You went back to having dairy, you went back to having milk on the tables. And I think that structurally long term, I think it's going to have an impact on people and how they shop at the store and what they bring home and how they eat at home.
We're going to turn the next question over to Mark and Andy here, and we're getting questions coming in. And this one's going to be a little bit of just your sense of the situation, Mark and Andy. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue obviously didn't pursue the idea of a government-driven supply constriction or management or whatever word you want to use. But do you have any idea how many co-ops or private entities, private processors have asked farms to reduce production? I know of plans from on the West Coast and throughout in the Midwest, but any sense of that?
Well, I've certainly gotten a lot of reports through our extension network of producers who have received letters. And that is true whether you're talking about marketing through a co-op, which the vast majority of our milk in this state is, or whether you're a direct shipper. The plants who just can't handle the same volume of milk have asked across all of their shippers, their dairy producers, that they restrict milk production. The limits on that restriction vary quite a bit, maybe anywhere from 5% at the low level to 20% at the higher level. So it depends, I suspect, quite a lot on just how those processors are seeing their channels, be available for sales. But yes, quite a lot of restrictions. It's happening at the entity level as opposed to any kind of regional or state, and certainly not national level.
Andy, anything?
I would first of all, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I think before long we're going to find that this is the rule, not the exception. And I would also say that let's keep in mind that there are independent processors, non-cooperative processors, who buy from independent farmers, or sometimes called direct ship farmers, who are allocating their plant to their farmers. A regulated handler in the federal order system cannot pay less than the blend price, and so they can't say, I'm going to pay you less for some amount of milk that they declare to be excess. But they can say, I'm only going to pick up 85% of the milk that you sold last year at the same time or last month or whatever. But they're not obliged to pick up all the milk you produce, absent some contractual agreement. But that's what's going to happen on the independent side. On the co-op side, I think we're seeing a lot of the big players either starting new programs or adding more aggressive numbers to existing programs, to the point where, and I think well over half the milk is going to be subject to these kinds of restrictions. I would also remind folks that the March numbers that just came out show 1 point something increase in January, 1 point more something increase in February, 2.2% increase in March. So we're in an environment where production is ramping up based on old prices, and demand is fallen into the canyon. And so, of course, dealing with something at the private industry level to stem that tide is going to be something we just see more and more of.
So another question that just came in, and I think we'll target this to Chad and John here. Real simple question. Are grocery sales higher in any specific categories because of this situation?
Yeah, I mean, in Wisconsin, I'll talk to the Wisconsin numbers. The numbers are up across the board. The first 2 weeks, powdered milk was up infinitely, right? Because it's not that big a category. The jump was, and those numbers have slid back down. The first 3-4 weeks, cheese was up 100% plus. And in the last 2 weeks, it's been up in the 35% range. So, and milk in Wisconsin was up, in the 50% range the first 2 weeks. It's now settling into like a 15-20% growth rate. These numbers are incredible in terms of what we've ever seen at retail. And I think that, we've settled into a new normal until the stay-at-home data or restrictions are released. And then we'll see how things, and if restaurants start coming back up. But I think you're going to see strong growth in the restaurant chains. I mean, in the grocery chains continued on here for quite a while.
Yeah, I would just add, and I think Chad mentioned this up front, there are some of our other ancillary dairy products that have been showing really strong volume growth as well. Frozen pizzas, for one. Cereal, again, nice, big, healthy, double-digit growth there, which is just really good news for us. And again, the hope that can sustain, beyond even, the lifting of the shelter in place is the real hope. Can we do enough to reinstill some of these older behaviors, older food preferences, is going to be the real key.
Yeah, I mean, yogurt's up, butter's up. I mean, it's across the board on the dairy line.
We got a question here. I'm just going to acknowledge to our viewers that we're going to save this question, and we're going to be doing Dairy Livestream all through April here and May, and we'll probably have some people from the National Checkoff on here. They can talk specifically what the National Dairy Checkoff is doing here. We'll let them speak to that question. John, you just started talking about this, and I think we're going to follow up here. There's two questions. I'm going to merge into one here. What are we doing to extend the curve on dairy consumption growth here long term on some of these changing patterns? In the second part, when we reimagine food service, we started out talking about that about 40 minutes ago. When we reimagine food service, how does dairy capture more of those returning dollars?
Well,
that's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll start with the first one. How do we encourage these behaviors, these refound behaviors to continue? We're doing a lot right now just in terms of trying to support consumers' interest in comfort food. Their interest in cooking again. Again, they're all of a sudden they're trying to do things that maybe they haven't done in years in terms of food preparation. And this is a great thing too, is just including the rest of the family, teaching kids how to cook. So again, we're trying to insert ourselves in there wherever we can to provide ideas and fun ways to do it and how to make it, again, interesting for kids. We're talking about doing a smoothie contest just for kids to get them thinking creatively about food and how to be healthy at the same time. So there's a lot of things there that we're going to try and do as well. The food service reimagination thing is, again, that's a tough one. There are a lot of issues that we're going to have to face with that channel to try and rebuild it. If I could offer one example, I think we need to try and learn from our past successes, and that's specifically pizza. Pizza is the perfect food for food service and for food service delivery. The cheese helps insulate the product, and it's one of the safest products out there because it's not touched from the point it goes into the oven till you take it out of the box at home, not touched by human hands. Plus, it tastes fabulous. So again, what can we learn from that to build off of that, to come up with other ideas for food service that they can do and leverage some of our great dairy products like cheese?
And I think there's a couple of things that the Checkoff world falls squarely into our wheelhouse. One is, John, you're talking about doing research earlier on what these trends are going to be and reimagining what food service will be. Who else is doing that research, right? So by getting out and really figuring this thing out and getting ahead of the curve, we can be a go-to resource for food service operators and major restaurants, and going in with that data. And when you get your foot in the door, all of a sudden you have much more leverage to get, your type of menu items on the table. And then the second thing is for me on how do we continue the growth curve on this thing going forward. That's kind of what another wheelhouse of what we do is communicating and telling the story. So, you know, we're working on, like John said, the triage, the stuff we got to fix today, but we haven't let our foot off the gas in terms of how we build sales and trust going forward. And I think that we'd be remiss if we took our eye off of making sure that we use this time when there's unprecedented amount of eyeballs on screens and on TVs and the lowest cost media on a per eyeball basis because national advertisers have walked away to tell our stories from farmers about how well we treat the earth, how well we treat the animals, and how good our products are for the planet and for you. And so that's where we're focusing our time and effort, making sure that we get today's emergencies fixed, but not taking our eye off the long term, so that when this thing does get back to normal, we are in an incredibly strong position.
Mark, I'm going to turn this one over to you because the next question is going to Andy. I had a number of farmers actually ask this question. I said, I just don't know. But why do you think DMC payments might be included in this USDA plan? What's the logic there?
I don't know for sure, Corey, but we've had that kind of limitation on payments before. I mean, think about the market facilitation payments, you know, where there were limits on what could be received by any given entity. And from what I understand, and you know, this is only hearsay, but that the limitation desire is coming more from the White House than it is from USDA. And so I don't know where this is starting from, but you know, there's some indication that, you know, we all need to be tough. You need to get out there and earn, you know, your way out of this situation. And I'm not sure how much that reflects naivety, but you know, it seems to me that it doesn't necessarily fully incorporate the reality of what this is. It's a really big imposed catastrophe on people. No one in particular's fault, but nevertheless, it wasn't earned.
Andy, this is a two-phase question here. One of them, I know you have some data from March on in the Northeast on milk dumping, and if you want to talk a little bit about that, and it may or may not weave into this second question. Why did Class 3 production increase in, I guess, the Northeast Federal Milk Marketing Order, and where did that come from? So, Andy?
Well, of course, every region is responding in part to what its customers are telling it, and also using whatever tools are available to it. So, which have obviously both of those factors are not the same in every part of the U.S. The Northeast, we're talking about the Eastern Seaboard, Boston to Washington, huge sales, a gigantic fluid market, also a gigantic Class 2 market. And of course, a gigantic every other market, I suppose. But the Northeast is a net importer of dairy products, and it's going to emphasize beverage milk and Class 2 products to the extent it could. New York has a lot of pride as an old cheese state, but the cheese volume has really declined relative to its heyday. And so what I would say, what we're seeing is that milk is backing up into cheese plants in the Northeast, in large part because the butter powder plants are limited and they're full. And so it's just a practical matter of where can we go. And I would say this is where you're seeing, this is an example of the distressed milk situation. I did, one of my buddies back in the Northeast sent me a message while we were talking saying, hey, Andy, she hit the click button on the Northeast numbers that just came out this morning. And what we're seeing is after a January that was a little elevated relative to the last 6 years, a February that was back to normal, the March number has increased dramatically. 22 million pounds dumped in the Northeast order, which I would remind you goes from Northern Virginia all the way up to Northern New England. This is not remotely a record for dumping in the Northeast, which has had to deal with dumping since 2015. But it puts it in the top 10, and we'll see where it goes from there. what this says to me is there's a lot of distressed milk moving around in the Northeast, and I think that's consistent with your cheese question.
So we got about 5 to 7 minutes here left of our question and answer period in our Hordes Dairyman Dairy live stream sponsored by Cargill. And I'm going to turn this question to Chad and to John here. What kind of interaction is taking place with food banks? I know Andy talked about the program from the USDA perspective, but there's been a lot of dynamics happening here with dairy and food banks real recently.
Yeah, I mean, very shortly, very briefly from Wisconsin, we partnered up a lot with Department of Agriculture, Feeding America, and we just announced a program with Hunger Task Force, raising millions of dollars to get dairy into the food banks throughout the state. Personally, our organization has put together a spreadsheet that outlines all 279, I think, food banks, food pantries in the state. We've reached out to all of them, understanding what it is that they need, what kind of format, what kind of capacity they have, and who's their main contact. And then, we have a group that does nothing but talk to the 109 cheese companies in the state on a daily basis and connecting them. Then what do you have? What do you want to donate? And basically we're the matchmakers, and then we get out of the way and let magic happen. But, we get calls every day. We're getting calls every day of, I've got 40,000 pounds of 5-pound bricks. Where can these go? We want to donate them to a food bank in the state or across the country. And people like Sargento stepping up and last week announcing $2 million worth of product donations that are going to go out this month. So the processors, the retailers, everybody is really stepping up. It's just a matter of we're just trying to figure out how do we grease the skids and make the transfer of products, get it from where it is to where it needs to go, because it's so complex. It's such a complex situation. But John, so what's going on out west?
I was just going to say the exact same thing. People I don't think fully realize and appreciate how complex it is. What seems very simple to just take milk that's being dumped and divert that to food banks, but it's got to go get processed, pasteurized. It's got to get packaged. It's got to get delivered, and somebody has to pay for all that. So, I mean, similarly, Chad, we've got a coalition of dairy organizations in California working with Feeding America, same kind of thing, just trying to figure out the logistics of this so it can happen more easily, because it's just, unfortunately, not an easy thing to do.
So the next questions here, Mark and Andy, perk your ears up here for reference to photographing cows. Multiple parts here. Is there any indication that if dairy farmers will qualify for the beef compensation as well? Obviously, cull cows are about 20% of the market of dairy animals. And then the other part of this is, will USDA handle conventional dairy, organic dairy, and grass-fed markets all the same or differently on the milk side?
Andy, I'm going to let you step into that, because right now I can tell you I haven't looked at the details outside of dairy, to speak of it all. And in fact, we don't have a lot of those details.
Yeah,
Andy?
for those of you who weren't clear, what Mark just said is Andy's more willing to be wrong than he is. I don't think there will be any allowance for differences in prices that farmers may get based on what they produce. I think this is going to be based off of the all milk price, period, the end. That's going to determine a $1 per 100 payment rate. And, you can say you got jerseys or whatever you want to say, and that's just going to be what it is. And I would say, as far as being a dairy farmer goes, I think you're eligible for the strawberry payment and the avocado payment and the almond payment and any other kind of payment if you demonstrate that you have commercial sales of those products. And that's going to be key. You're going to have some kind of data that does this. If you're in a major crops program and you've got a corn base, that would say FSA knows you produce corn. I don't know how that's going to work for specialty crops, but I would say whatever rules apply, if you sell it and you've got a track record, you're going to be eligible.
Yeah, and I think you dodged that question, Andy. I was thinking cull cows in particular.
Well, again, we don't know until we see the rules, but I think the key thing is you've got to be able to demonstrate that you have a pattern of revenue from the sale of something. And I would be surprised if USDA would say, oh, that was a little tiny Jersey bull. No, that doesn't count. I think it's going to be about, do you have, sales from meat animals?
We're going to wrap up with one final question here for Chad and John, and if Mark and Andy want to jump in, go ahead. Is there anything we can learn from this situation when it comes to future dairy product processing to prevent it happening again? Now, with that in mind, I think the viewers should know that our U.S. plants are very highly specialized. And for example, maybe in New Zealand, they have a big spring flush of milk, and those plants have to ramp up for a big volume at one time. The markets are a little different in serving people around the world. So the question is, what are we learning from this that can help us in the future in terms of dairy product processing?
Well, I think the one thing we've learned that many cheese companies have learned is that, they're very specialized and they're very, very good at what they do. And it's very difficult to pivot. So I think my guess is that for some of these folks, they're going to start looking at, how do I become more diversified? Because the cheese plants that have a retail, an ingredient, and a food service business are faring a lot better than the people that are, we've got a lot of plants that are 100% food service. And they're struggling right now. So when food service reigns, they do really well. But in times like this, I think you're going to see more diversification along the way.
John or Mark, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's spot on, Chad. When I've talked with folks that just changing even the size of a filler that you may have for, shredded cheese from an industrial size package to something that's more consumer size. If you make that part of your normal sales channel, then perhaps you at least have the possibility of selling into this kind of rapid change in environment rather than just saying, I have no sales.
Corey, I would offer two comments. One, as this topic has come up, I keep remembering the old farm management guy at Cornell, much beloved teacher, who used to say, if you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, it better be a pretty damn strong basket. And I think we're finding out now that our risk assessment has just had to be totally recalibrated because unimaginable things are now happening. So I think it will make a change. However, I would point out the difference between consolidation effects and conglomeration effects. It is completely ridiculous, in my opinion, to imagine that some little cheese plant that's taken, a few loads of milk a day is going to say, oh yeah, I should expand my retail business and put in all the packaging and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's just not really very feasible. But I think what we will see is more of a conglomerated effect where an overall company in their overall system says, I got to have more baskets and, eggs that can be moved from here to there, which is to say a lot of the larger organizations just have options, have a little bit more resilience now than kind of the one trick pony operations that, when that goes sour, they got nowhere to go.
John, the final word is yours.
I would just add to Chad's diversification message and add that to channel management. What we saw, most recently was a misalignment of channels and overburdening of one versus another. We've got to figure out how to manage that more appropriately in the future. Again, this just-in-time inventory approach is problematic, and it makes it that much more challenging. So how do we make sure that our products can flow, if they have to, through multiple channels, including now e-commerce, and particularly the click and collect? I think that's one where we really have got to, dial that up and figure that out, because that can be a benefit to both the retailer and the consumer, and to the industry as a whole in terms of, delivering seamlessly from farm to table.
With that, we're approaching the top of the hour here, and I'd like to remind everyone the conversation will continue next Wednesday, April 29th at 11 o'clock Central Daylight Time. I want to close with this analogy here, and I appreciate everybody's candor here as we sort through this information. I enjoy history here, and this might be a strong analogy, but this is a unique time. There was a time during World War II that Winston Churchill sent every boat that England had across the English Channel to save the soldiers at Dunkirk and live to fight another day. And then they had their perhaps most shining hour in the British Empire is when they stormed the beaches of Normandy. We may not know all the details right now. We're figuring out a strategy. We're working together. A little bit of this has been early on triage management, but we will emerge from this and we will continue the conversation next week. Our program next week will be sponsored by Lalamad. This week's program again was sponsored by Cargill, and we appreciate so much their generous support. We thank you to Chad Vincent and John Talbot for joining us from Wisconsin and California. And Mark Stevenson and Andy, thank you again for joining us. And that wraps it up here from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Again, I'm Corey Geiger, editor of Hordes Dairyman. Have a great day.